Hafaday, Hafaday, and good morning. Okay, we'll go ahead and start now. Hafaday, good morning. The Committee on Health convenes this informal discussions at the request of Ms. Andrea Pelicani, Grassroots Guam. I know that the organization has some very important guests here this weekend. And today we want to give the opportunity for policymakers to be able to have this one-on-one discussion with the professionals and to be able to shed some light and guidance as to how, as policymakers, we could provide our contributions to really get this program, the medical cannabis program, moving forward on Guam. I'll introduce the senators here, and then I'll turn it to Andrea. You can introduce those who are here, members of the public who are here too. Thank you very much. The acting speaker, Therese Terlahi, thank you very much. Senator Regine Lee, Senator Mary Torres, the vice chairman of the committee, Senator Fernando Esteves. Senator Nelson, thank you very much for being here. Would you like to go ahead and introduce your...
I think we all know who I am. I'm Drea Pelicani. This is Steph Scherer from Americans for Safe Access, Nick Easley from 3C Consulting, Genevieve Sablan, a partner at Grassroots, Janine Sablan, a partner at Grassroots, and everybody knows John.
Great, thank you very much. So I understand you just completed a successful workshop over the weekend, right? To kind of educate our public and professionals on our side here to be able to see what could be done. I know that throughout the few years, the legislature has done whatever it could at the request and at the response of community leaders, stakeholders, on how we can get this program moving. We've worked with public health as well. We've got the rules and regs going, but there is just still those stumbling blocks. And so we do appreciate Grassroots Guam bringing over you folks here. This is your second or third. I know for Nick, it's been your first trip. Okay. Great. So we'll go ahead and give you opportunity to introduce yourself, and then after that, we'll open the floor for any senators for their questions.
Fantastic. So I'm the founder and executive director of Americans for Safe Access. We're a patient advocacy group that brings together stakeholders in medical cannabis. So we work with doctors, scientists, patients, and our funds come from our members. We have over 150,000 members, and so our job is to create resources to help bring these programs forward. I founded the organization in 2002, so it's been a long run. But the good news is that over the years we've been able to fill the gaps that are needed for governments to be able to implement the program. And after being, I feel like I've been here a lot longer than 3 days, but it's been busy and exciting. And after talking to several stakeholders, I think I have a better sense of where these roadblocks are. And part of it has to do with the want within the administration for a program to move forward. That's usually a huge component of that. But I think that there's, people I've talked to are a little overwhelmed by what it takes to implement a program. And the good news is that these programs have now been implemented in 30 states and now 31 countries. So Guam is coming into a time where you don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are product safety standards from seed to consumption that are available just to be adopted. Our organization has created continuing medical education courses that are AMA certified. So there's guidance for your doctors. We've created patient information, guidance for law enforcement. And it's really just a matter of seeing what these resources are and utilizing them. And I know that Nick on a few trips before had brought these resources to the administration and maybe they weren't utilized. But I think there's also, within the law, there were some requirements for the committee to meet. There was very specific stakeholder groups that were supposed to be appointed. And from what I understand, the entire committee has not been appointed. The committee just told us today that they've never met. And so that seems to be a pretty, like at least one thing that would show why the program isn't moving forward. The committee has responsibilities to move this. They also, in our meeting today, or right before this, definitely I got a sense that people were overwhelmed, and we've offered to, our organization has offered to create a report for the transition government, whatever that is, of where we see the gaps, what prioritizing those gaps, and things that the actual action steps that need to happen, as well as linking them to resources that already exist. And I think that following that, if we could work with the Department of Public Health to create a budget for each of those items, so that it's actually, because you know, I think for your side, it's really hard when agencies say they need more money. Everyone needs more money, and so I think if we can get those specifics down, that it would help you all to be able to utilize your power in this committee and for oversight to push those departments. But I think that there is a clear pathway forward. My organization, we do have members here in Guam that are very frustrated, and there's a lot of confusion for patients without much information from government. So we also are finding a lot of misinformation is being spread to patients and to doctors and to lawyers, and so there's really a strong need for guidance from the government of how all the stakeholders should participate and how they can move forward. So thank you.
Yeah, good morning. It's very acceptable. Good morning, Nick Easley. I'm CEO of 3C Consulting, also Managing Director of Multiverse Capital, and about 100 different companies in the cannabis industry. Really, I started 2006. Colorado Medical really saw how that program shaped up. Was the first commercial medical cannabis program. Also, we did Prop 64, first adult use cannabis program in the world. And then from that, 5 years ago, started working with Canada, multiple other countries. I know probably Steph's organization and my organization have probably gone to almost every single legalized country or pending legal country in the world, and states. I've had clients in all 30 states, even the District of DC, Puerto Rico, and then Guam has got a much better program. It just, some of the stalls were kind of challenging. What I've at least seen with my experience is all of the specific details and minutiae of a program for pesticide testing, or what to do with wastewater, or how to actually, do you have to background check staff, and what are the badging requirements, let's say, for patients? How do you educate law enforcement? All of these things. What I found with programs, I hate to see a state or a territory or a country government try to figure all this out on your own. So from my standpoint, having really referred Americans for Safe Access, a nonprofit, and their patient-focused certification program, where ASTM standards, ISO standards, because federal governments can't tell us how to regulate the program, or tell you, like the USDA can't be like, all right, Department of Agriculture, these are the pesticides you can use on cannabis and not. So essentially, there were a few other standards organizations that were all for profit. And when I think about the longest, oldest, most bona fide nonprofit that's patient focused, actually having those standards where it's for patient safety, program safety, there's no better resource that Gov Guam could use, that all of these resources are already prepared. I have noticed in the past that when we think about budgets, I knew initially the governor's administration was looking, it's like, hey, we're going to need $8 million to govern this program. They were basing that on states that were 50 times your population, that were enormous. So when we actually looked at some of these budgets, what do they need initially, and how can we actually pass the cost of like these certification and these programs actually onto the businesses themselves, where it's going to make it a little harder for them to get cash flow positive, but it doesn't matter. This is a long-term medical program, long-term potential economic opportunity for the island. So I know with like patient-focused certifications, having the mandate that like all cultivators, extraction, manufacturing, all retail organizations follow those standards, and then also have to pay for those standards, so it doesn't make the government of Guam have to go out of their own pocket to do that. So at least from what I see is like trying to make program updates here currently, like there have been RFIs issued for like seed to sale. There have been requests, all the misinformation on like, oh, no labs want to come here. I know 6 labs that would come here instantly. So I know we've talked about what essentially 3 RFPs are needed for like seed to sale laboratories, because there's not a specific lab license yet, like to apply for, as well as then an RFP for like a certification governing body that can do the auditing and then have the government of Guam do the enforcement of that, which then allows like co-training during that time. interesting elections this week, so then essentially after Wednesday to know, okay, what's the transition report based on the proposed pending administration? What then needs to happen? That Cannabis Commission, those 11 members, that hasn't happened, and it's a part of the law. So I'd like to really, after this transition report, to say, what are the responsibilities of that commission? Not just biannual meetings and choosing new qualifying conditions, but like reviewing those RFPs, RFIs, reviewing those budgets, and actually acting as like the government's special kind of group to inform the governor, be it her or him, here after Wednesday. I'd like them to then create those RFPs, ask a commission to send those out, review those RFPs, accept those RFPs, and then train all stakeholders, Department of Ag, Rev and Tax, Department of Agriculture, Guam Medical Association, to actually train those on that. Because then the next step are businesses applying for licenses, which they could do now, and they could have done for years, but in the beginning they wouldn't give us business licenses, let's say, or patients didn't know how to actually get a doctor. So I know that Steph's organization and mine have pledged that by November 13th we will send various FAQs for patients, for regulators, for home growers, even for law enforcement. What are the things that they need to look at? What can they do and not do based on the law if a patient, you know, has medical cannabis? Like if they're driving and smoking a joint, that's not necessarily protected compared to if they have half an ounce or how many plants they can have. So we're kind of right at that moment, the FAQs, the education component, knowing what the program pitfalls are in other markets so that you don't have to repeat those same mistakes and go a little faster, because 4 years is a little slower on average for most states. But if there's not major action done here soon, it's going to be another 4 years. And then at that point, you've got Saipan, Marianas, people from Guam actually going to other places to get medical cannabis. So we just want to see how we can actually get this program that your constituents asked for over 4 years ago actually in place and happening, where they don't have to grow at home. Where even hearing about a patient here, one of the 9 patients, they have kids at home. They don't have the space to grow, but now that's the only way they can get their medicine. There's no commercial program, and it's like, I can't have medicine then if I can't grow it at home. What do I actually do instead of making more, essentially, caregiver programs to allow more people to grow for them, which has always been a problem in other states, because then you have lots of plants, no seed to sale tracking, no weight requirements, no testing requirements, and then how do you know, did these 100 plants get grown and given to patients for no cost, or did another 5 pounds go somewhere it shouldn't have? That's what will really hurt a program that you're trying to get medicine to patients as quick as possible, but in going too fast for large caregiver programs, you can actually really hurt the potential business component of this, and then also the program efficacy. So really an honor to be back here. Always been a resource for Guam. I know 3 years. If it takes another 3, we'll keep. If it takes another 30, as long as the weather doesn't get bad here, we'll keep on coming. Thank you very much for this morning.
Great. Thank you very much. We have a very unique situation here. The Vice Chairman and I, we're on our way out. About 2 months left, and we'll do whatever we could in the 2 months. But you have 4 very strong and passionate women here that I can say with confidence they'll be back next term, and that they'll be very instrumental in really getting this program to move forward. A lot of what Nick you have said is exactly the problem, the challenges that we're facing. The government, at least the executive branch, thinks that we got to do everything on our own, when we've been saying we got to perhaps do a public-private partnerships. And even the lab component, we don't, they say the legislature has never appropriated the $1 million minimum that's needed to stand the program up. We've said, we looked at options that the government does not have to shoulder that investment. If there's some public-private partnerships that are, that are put together. And so the commission did meet, I think we did meet once, because I am a member of that. There were other statutory members that were not appointed yet. But it's not clear. The role and responsibilities of the commission as well is not clear. My understanding, and I think what's being interpreted, is that the commission is there to provide guidance once the program is stood up, to make recommendations and to kind of help in moving it forward. If that's what's needed, if that's a desire at this point to make the amendment so that when a new commission is stood up, then the commission is the one that helps stand everything up, then that's an option we can take a look at to make it clearer. But for now, it's really it's public health that the onus is on them to be able to get this program moving. And to their defense as well, they have so much other responsibilities and mandates. We've even recommended perhaps establishing a special bureau, just to get this program going. But those are things that I know that the senators who will be returning will have to deal with as we move this forward. But I'll go ahead and open it to the Vice Chairman and then the Speaker and whoever else.
Thank you. I appreciate you guys for coming. I had took a couple notes, and thank you for this opportunity. I think the dialogue and the expertise is really important on Guam. Moving forward with this, I've always had to identify issues that, even though there are many jurisdictions and countries, it does provide a great resource for us to develop our program. And I'm sure that you can state with your experience, each state has its own unique quirks. Every location has its own unique situations, and Guam's going to be no different. It needs to be a program that works for Guam. Right. Which I know you understand, and I always want to urge that as a matter of the policy making. One thing that I'm curious, I know you've assisted with the program in DC, and I know you've had some works with Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has approved the program. Were there any special challenges with regards to their workings with the federal government because of their territorial status?
You want to go first, or?
Yeah, so in DC, the first medical cannabis law was actually passed by voter initiative in 97 or 98, and Congress did block the implementation for about 12 years. But DC is different in that I also, I live in DC. I don't have a member of Congress either, so I understand that part, but it's actually a little worse. Our taxes are really horrible, but we also, Congress oversees our budget. So they use our budget as a political soapbox a lot of times. So there was an amendment that was put in place, and then we had to overturn that amendment. So that was, but DC is very unique. And Puerto Rico, there have not been any problems. There hasn't, the federal government hasn't done anything different than any of the other states.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Of course.
And that, I think, though, moving forward, that's always going to be something we always need to keep an eye on, because, obviously that can change with any administration of the federal government as well, how they want to enforce that.
The one thing I would say that is very helpful is that even though this is illegal federally, our organization has passed an amendment to the Department of Justice's budget. We've done this now for 5 years. That covers medical cannabis, and we were able this year to actually get the language in the budget, the original budget, so we don't have to go through a floor amendment this year. So it's in there, so it will be in the 2019 budget, and Guam is listed specifically to be protected. So that is a Band-Aid.
Wow.
Of course, and I think it's odd policy making, but so is passing laws state by state to break federal laws. So there's a lot of uniqueness in this space, but it is there, and it does create the space for Guam to move forward with its program. And so what I've found is that people who want to oppose medical cannabis have a list of talking points. They have to worry about losing federal funding, and my job is to take those off of the opponent's plates. So that is not a problem, and our organization has written many white papers. If that is coming up for any sort of impediment to implementation, please let me know. We took that one off the table. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's just a matter now of just getting it
Well, what I'm really worried about for this program is that it's the 4 years is, as Nick said, that's the longer end. There are some states that have taken that long, but in the states that took that long, there were patient lawsuits that started about this time. That there's an obligation, that they've been promised that this is coming. I also heard from many of the elected officials and people running for office on Saturday that they had constituents that have gone to the United States because of medical cannabis and can't come back until the program is up and running. And that's, it's a very real thing. We actually work with a lot of, we call them medical cannabis refugees that have to leave their home and family to go somewhere where they have access. And after just spending a few days here, I think it would be really horrible to be separated from Guam because you couldn't use your medicine.
Yeah, and from what I've seen, at least like with Puerto Rico, like we always used to talk about the Cole Memorandum. It was like our 8 rules we followed so we were safe and good, and then, the glorious Jeff Sessions pretty much just ripped those up. And that was just a couple-page memo that it was like about IDing, preventing safe access, or like child access, or not having firearms at organizations. So from a medical standpoint, we know what North Marianas did, for example, is not the way to go for just legalizing adult use. It's the first time we've seen a state or a territory choose to do that. I see major complications with that. In our 7 adult use states that we had medical that transitioned to adult use that still have medical programs, Washington, tried to get rid of their medical program for higher tax rates, so all patients would have to pay the excise taxes, which here, not having sales tax, just those gross receipt side, there's no need for additional taxes on anything medical. On business licenses and fees on the taxes for the operations that are servicing those patients, absolutely. Like there's a revenue source there. The adult use side, as long as it's done after a medical program, we haven't seen federal intervention, as long as those organizations are following the state law and not having diversion happen. But you're at this moment now where, mentioning those patient lawsuits, I've seen them. I've also seen that injunctive reliefs, and I've also seen now at this point where you, as a government, essentially now have created exposure, where you have businesses that could be applying for licenses, purchasing land, waiting for these programs, knowing that the onus was on the Department of Health, this Cannabis Commission, to do that. So now, depending on how the administration goes in this transition and how actively the government of Guam or the Department of Health chooses to do this, you could be looking at, from patients, from organizations, from outside organizations, nonprofit groups, or like National Cannabis Bar Associations, and then also businesses themselves incorporated on Guam or elsewhere that have then now had losses or potential future, like that's what I don't want to see happen. And I've seen it from about 3 years of a delay, and then after that they start coming 3, 4, 5. Then a patient dies that could have been on medical cannabis that didn't, and then you're looking at, that's what we don't want to see. So now it's this moment, you've got the law. It's actually a pretty good law. What ASA and Senator Barnes worked on years ago, amazing, like the program that is here. And even if it's less than 200,000 people, it's this moment, you've got a great climate, you've got the willingness of the departments to listen to this. The Department of Health, Department of Agriculture all want to know more about this program, but how to do it safely, and that's where I don't want to see 4 years of you trying to figure out how to do this. Take everything that ASA has done from a nonprofit standpoint of all of those pitfalls, take those, cater those to Guam, will be the best thing possible. And then if in the future adult use happens, or medical reciprocity, where you're allowing people from other places with an active card, like if I'm a diabetic and I come to Guam, I don't need to go to get a new doctor to give me an insulin prescription to just go to, like, that's kind of ridiculous. So once we're actually seeing this as medicine, how do we actually create that program? And 95% of your work is done for pesticide testing, for hand washing procedures, for everything that needs to be done, GMP, for like food grade facilities for making edibles. You get to choose what sorts of products you're going to allow. Do you want gummy bears or not? Like those little things need to be here. And I always try to, we don't make Oxycontin gummy bears is my expression. Why do cannabis? We want to see the SAFE program for Guam. Unfortunately, yes. But also for like I mentioned at the workshop this weekend, how for patients to talk to their children, like if they are growing at home, what is this, how to keep that safe, how to use it responsibly. But we have to do something for the commercial program to come soon, because the caregivers are not going to be able to continue to just support and provide that medicine. But the questions that we asked before of like the program policy problems with Puerto Rico, that was like 5 Ps. With Puerto Rico and also the Harris Amendment in DC, where adult use was legalized. Like they voted for that, but then the Harris Amendment, they can't enact it because they would take all their funds. That sort of thing wouldn't happen as long as certain rules are done in the correct fashion here. And with this new change in government possibly happening this week, 3-4 years into the program, I mean, we've got patients here on Guam already, doctors making recommendations. That's where exposure is starting to be created. So I really appreciate like the forefront nature the government's taking to do something to get the program in place.
And something that you mentioned, the idea of an amendment that could happen during the transition period. Right now, there's a list of responsibilities for the Department of Public Health, and then there's a list of responsibilities for the commission, which the commission has to be appointed by the governor's office. So I'm just wondering, just knowing that, I've worked on lots of government transitions that can take a while. What would be your recommendations for an amendment? Would it be to maybe clarify what the public health's responsibility is and put more of the onus on the Department of Public Health, or to put more of the onus of the next steps on a commission?
I think with what we saw with other commissions, and this was going to be in my next question, in reading the policy, the understanding was kind of the same way the commission as he read it, and that might be something we need to revisit, because it seemed as though the commission was kind of going to steer it after the program's implementation. But what I've seen through my experience in the legislature, albeit short, with a lot of commissions and groups, is that these commissions, and the purpose of them many times is to provide the technical expertise that's not available, right, in different fields. And you're not necessarily going to find that in the classified rank and file of a government executive agency like Department of Public Health. And so I think that one of the hiccups is obviously that we haven't established a commission, but we haven't established their position and their value in getting the project started up, because we can see so much more potential delays in RFPs and RFIs that were not written properly, resulting in a lot of litigation on protests. Which is going to be that happens in so many different contracts.
Of course.
If the technical details aren't in there.
Right.
And that's why I think that the commission would be able to provide that technical expertise to public health, rather than public health trying to have the expertise internally amongst all of the other responsibilities that they already have. And that's why we have kind of that diversity with the commission. Are there other states that have maybe bypassed an executive branch appointment? Or how are the commissions formed within other jurisdictions? What are some other models we could potentially look at under the law?
So I think, there are many states that create actually medical cannabis departments, and they do that. Some of them are under the Department of Health, some of them are under Tax and Revenue. Our recommendation is actually public health, but to have input of the Department of Agriculture, Tax and Revenue, that they're a part of that, because implementing a medical cannabis law means that you have to really look at the patient's life and how they interact with all agencies, and making sure that there are policies that recognize them as law-abiding citizens once they become medical cannabis patients.
Is that the most common trend, that it's consistent of government officials from within the different organizations?
There's usually so there's, if there's a budget, there's usually a director that's hired that specifically works on that, and they coordinate with all agencies. For medical cannabis programs, there's heavy lifting at the beginning. There's more staff needed. And then once licenses are out, then you're really talking about overseeing a few inspections every year, a couple reports to the legislature. It doesn't become a huge program, but you have to have those resources to get the program up and running. And I think what I learned today, talking to the Commission and the Department of Public Health, was that they were unclear what resources they needed. They knew that they needed more funds, but didn't really know exactly what that looked like. And I know as legislators, again, when someone says they need more money, that isn't very helpful. So I think that is, because by the way, I need more money. I don't know.
Just a follow up, and then the other senators, please, you can jump in. Have you ever seen any other state, though, use perhaps a nonprofit to see them more involved in the implementation process? Because governments, as you said, are short, always short, and resources are limited. But have you seen where perhaps a public-private is is had to be able to move the program forward?
Not in the sense that that a nonprofit was hired to take over the implementation work. Our organization works with every state, and part of those resources, like everything we mentioned, are free resources. But we've also developed programs that are paid services that include training staff within the departments on how to work on this issue. We actually have a contract with the state of Maryland. We trained their auditors. We have a contract with the state of Delaware. We trained their labs. So there's a lot of models out there of what that could look like, but you can't outsource the implementation because a nonprofit wouldn't have any teeth, right? We get if you handed this over to the nonprofit to tell agencies what to do, they wouldn't really have the power to do that. That being said, I think that the work that we've done, our nonprofit here in Guam, as far as passing the law and giving that support, we've offered that same support in the implementation and haven't really been taken up on it. We're told by the first commissioner that they were very excited to utilize our services, and then we didn't hear back. So maybe we should charge, maybe then people would see more value, but the value of this is that it came from blood, sweat, and tears of our organization, and really watching over the last 16, now almost 17 years, what works and what doesn't work, and how to avoid major pitfalls.
From an organizational standpoint on who actually is going to regulate, govern, and oversee these special departments, Colorado, for example, the Marijuana Enforcement Division, that was purely out of the revenue side, revenue tax and enforcement, which had no idea about anything health, no idea about anything agricultural, and created major problems. California then makes the Bureau of Cannabis Control, and each state has their own. Whenever it's been done through the Department of Health, working in conjunction with Department of Ag and Revenue Tax, but them as the lead, best programs that we've seen thus far, because then this is about health. This isn't about revenue. That's a part of it, and then tracking the plants. I have seen for some of those public-private partnerships, they did issue an RFI, not an RFP yet, for a seed-to-sale tracking. Oftentimes those will have additional add-ons. There's all these different components that actually will cost the government money. What I like to see is actually putting that impetus on the actual producers. So depending on how many cultivators, extractors, retailers, what's it going to cost, essentially for these nonprofits to provide the services for Guam? And many are already done and can just be leveraged to cater towards Guam. But passing on the inspection costs, the certification costs, the staff training costs, all to the operators, because they all have to get trained and certified in these sorts of standards in order to produce, to be able to sell. Those first list I went through of what needs to happen, then you have business licenses, those inspections, all the normal pre-construction, direct construction, certificate of occupancy, and then the testing standards before, then they can have plants. They can't sell until they get a seller's permit when they actually are passing their facility inspection and passing test results of their first harvests. Those are the things that I know that ASA and through the patient-focused certifications can do, but not doing it under just revenue tax or just agriculture, but Department of Health, but even redefining, essentially, if we could think about that Cannabis Commission of what actually should they need to do, to where it's not just one department, because I've also seen a Department of Health given too many responsibilities and overwhelmed, and I would say, i.e. see the last 3 years of the Department of Health, with what Jim Gillen had to go through, he's this is just too much and it's overwhelming, to now, how do we break it down into pieces, provide those extra things, and what could the nonprofit do that your government couldn't do yet? And then through that training and transition process, passing more and more of that on to your departments, to where that would reduce the cost and burden on operators in the future, but also things are constantly changing. That's what at least I like from working all over the country and world. When we still are involved in programs, we can continually evolve with those programs too.
And it's not an unusual requirement to have businesses use a third-party certification and training, and that's something that could be done, through an RFI, an RFP, to outsource the auditing. The enforcement, of course, would always have to come from the government. But to give you sort of an example of what that would look like, our organization, we have a 4-hour training for cultivators, for manufacturers, for people who work in laboratories and in dispensaries, just for the basic staff. We have a 28-hour training for managers, for QA, QC staff, and these are available for members and agencies could also take these trainings. But what we do is we actually make sure all of the staff have training, and then we send auditors to the location. We create corrective actions and work with the companies to implement those corrective actions. But in a situation where where it's required by government, those corrective actions would be shared with the Department of Public Health, saying we inspected the site, these are the things that we saw, and then it would make sense just for the auditors at the Department of Public Health just to go look for those corrective actions. So that's the difference of a 2-day audit and an hour audit, right? And so that's a way that you can lessen the resource requirements at the government level, and the businesses pay for the PFC certification. That's not a burden of the government. So that's definitely something that we can do. We've been doing in other states, and can bring in immediate expertise and take some of the financial burden off the program.
Yeah, just I wanted to thank you for your assistance, and looking forward to your transition plan or assistance in a transition plan, specific budgets for public health, and the resources that you've already offered. I wasn't aware of that until this weekend. But as to the composition of the commission, you've taken a look at that, and I guess you're going to have some recommendations on that also.
Yes.
Is there a part where this commission, let's say we gave it the authority to stand up the program, and not solely on public health, but this commission was going to be, composed of people that actually could help every component of the program. Is there a part that we as legislators should be concerned about, where corruption might come in, or where do we stand guard on that? I think there was a little bit of a concern when we first started hearing about this industry that some big players would come in and monopolize it, or things like that. Is that what would you recommend to us as policymakers to safeguard against that, keep a level playing field, and allow as many businesses to participate as possible?
Well, yeah, and from what I've seen, that our industry kind of came from the gutter, and then it didn't necessarily bring the most savory practitioners, let's just say, or the people who actually had the information on how to do this had been knowingly breaking the law for decades. So it's kind of been a nice transition period over this last decade for me to watch that happening and realizing that side didn't know business, policy, and was more of just, kind of cash economy. There are some great components of your law when there's like the residency requirement. I always push for residency requirement in markets in states where there hasn't been that. I see the out-of-state giant operators come, monopolize programs. They have the methodology, the cash flow, the knowledge. They get the right real estate. They bring all their staff, don't really create many jobs. So your residency requirement is really important. For the lab side, I know that was one that was potentially going to be lifted because we couldn't find a local lab operator here. For those things, though, we'll send over some examples on the 13th RFPs that have been successful in other states and which ones have not, that allowed those corruption loopholes to happen. In the case of Nevada, their seed-to-sale tracking software had major problems, exposed 9,900 patients' data open source, and all the confidential information of all the owners and operators. That caused them major lawsuits based on who they chose because they didn't have certain data security policy requirements for who was going to be safeguarding all of their data. So we'll send those examples. The other issue, I had a big problem. I don't own any independent testing labs, for example. Like, I'm not Volkswagen doing my own testing and making the cars and saying that they're safe to drive. Like, that doesn't work.
You cannot do that.
So that's why I've seen that labs are the gatekeepers of the industry, and if they don't have the right methodologies or certifications or protocols, it's very easy for them to alter results, and if those are owned by the operators, or to start failing their competitors' products to keep them from getting market share. This is business, we know those things can happen, so having at least 2 labs, even initially here saying the Department of Health should be doing the testing, that makes total sense if this wasn't federally illegal, because you can't be actually aiding and abetting the program. You can be safeguarding the program, but it has to be private businesses doing that. So the RFPs will be really helpful for insulating some of that possibility, but also knowing every single gram, every single plant being tracked, logged, tested, from recall procedures, like so that you can't have, let's say, something pass or fail testing, sit for 6 months, and then a lobbying group change that, so then they can now make that into cannabis oils, and then still like have, it's like, no, that failed, it failed 2 tests, like from 2 labs, like so that they're always keeping that data, and then you can say this has to be destroyed, can't be sold to veterans for 1 penny when you actually are selling them poison. Anything that has created corruption in a program where limited license states or countries are nice, because then you won't have 1,000 people coming and then lots of businesses starting and going out of business. But I do like to open markets. If they have the capital, the knowledge, expertise, they can pass the application process, certification process, the right security systems and protocols, not just how heavy a safe might be, which is important, but there's more important things on a safety standpoint. But if you put the safeguards in place initially, you have the right trained auditors from your department and from your enforcement division that's not just enforcing based on revenue, but on safety and health. The corruption is much easier to get rid of from the inception of a program.
I would also say the selection committee is very important, and right now there's an application that's available for businesses, but no one has really been able to answer who is going to decide who gets the licenses. And so one place we definitely have seen corruption was who was on the selection committee. So there have been several lawsuits in states where, you know, the nepotism or someone's buddy got all the licenses. So
seen many times.
So we can also offer some language around deciding the selection committee, and it may be somewhere where the legislature could act in that realm, so you don't have everything in one department. So the Department of Health saying these are the criteria, this is who's going to select it, so just to create some balance.
And total transparency in that as well. I've seen states where they had even countries confidential kind of scoring matrix, and then this team would win and this team would lose, but there's not, through the application, the current application, there's 16 components, and of those 16 components, many are define your operational policies and procedures. Like for me, owning a company that writes applications all over the world, I'm like, that's an easy one, because then we're just going to flood it with information and there's no specifics. And then I know that as long as I just babble for long enough, I'll hit anything that might matter. So I'd like to see in the future how to like actually score those applications.
Yep.
And they do have a policy now where it's like that's submitted, they have 30 days to review, and then there's a 14-day kind of administrative period where you need to take these corrective actions to fix it. But having that all be open source. There are certain components of applications that are confidential, of like financial disclosure, security, so on those doing trade secret confidential, but then keeping that open. So, I mean, you're subject to like freedom of information. That act, like as businesses lose applications, they will FOIA every single thing about the department, and I'd rather just be transparent and open in the beginning, so it's not buddy-buddy, or we're giving 1 lab license, and then we're giving 3 cultivation licenses. But the transparency is one way to really get rid of that nepotism side.
If I may add, I remember initially when the program, when the statute passed, and then the Department of Public Health and Social Services were tasked to develop the rules and regulations. One of the first announcements that was made was the director saying there are going to be 3 licenses. This was a concerning thing for Senator Barnes, who was the author of the bill, because she felt that there was that room for corruption, that room for, with this limitation, and what was the subjectivity that was going to be written into the awarding of licenses. So when she reviewed the policy, what she did is, and if you read the strengthened version before the new rules were adopted, you would be able to identify some of the fair market policy measures that she put in place. And I agree with Nick that there needs to be a scoring system, some sort of matrix, but what Senator Barnes's bill did was took out the subjectivity of the Department of Public Health to say, well, you can get a license and you can't. And the subjectivity that was taken out was merely if you meet all the requirements, they must award you a license. Now, if that's something that you want to revisit, by developing a matrix, I think that would be a good thing, that there would be a scoring system. You met this qualification, you met this qualification. I think that can definitely be improved. But again, the important thing to note was that subjectivity was taken away because the initial announcement that there were going to be a limitation of 3 licenses. And the qualification based on the rules that were presented was the biggest, the people with the most money, the people with the biggest investment. And we thought that wasn't necessarily going to be a good thing for fair market. There's going to be a lot of adjustment period. There are going to be businesses that are going to stand up and ultimately fail, but that's the market taking care of itself, and the fittest will survive. And it's not necessarily the people. It shouldn't necessarily be the people with the most money. It should be the people who are doing good business. And so that is something that, you know, I'm pretty sure these guys would be able to come up with as far as a matrix or a rubric for scoring.
Thank you. Just one more question. On the labs, you're making it sound that there's a legal impediment to having the labs run by the government.
Yes.
That you're recommending for sure that be third party. So this is not a source of income for any governments right now?
No, it's not.
Not the lab testing.
Okay.
The source of revenue is not only, I mentioned kind of at the workshop this weekend, the revenue that's going to come from the department, if we're thinking first purely medical, which is what we're discussing here currently, you're going to have the application and the licensing fees, you know, from the businesses themselves. If there's a cost component, let's say for like patient-focused certification that they have to do, there's sometimes not so much a rev share component there, but where they're paying the operators like for their certifications and trainings, that also helps to augment the budget of those departments. There's not going to be actual sales taxes like those gross receipt taxes or excise taxes on the patient sales, but there are taxes on the businesses that are actually producing those, so that's the revenue stream, plus the additional velocity of capital of all the other business services, construction, pre-construction, architecture, engineering, packaging companies, waste disposal, electricity, water, like taking the discharge and the industrial waste. So that side will come, and it's a little slower. Adult use side, excise taxes in some states, I mean, we've done billions of dollars of additional taxes just in the first few years of programs. Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for giving us this opportunity, and thanks very much to Steph and Nick and to Grassroots for all the information. I was able to attend a little bit of Saturday's presentation, and I think I just have 2 quick questions. I mean, we could sit here and talk about this all day. I think there's a lot of, you know, meat to chew off this bone. But one of the things that was interesting to me, I think Jonathan had raised it about a Veterans Affairs directive, and that was the first time I had heard of it. So if you could speak a little bit to that point, and then I want to talk a little bit about workplace protections. But if you could just give us all an update about the Veterans Affairs piece.
Yeah, so a lot of things that we pass at the federal level are baby steps, and for a long period of time, it was an automatic, a veteran would automatically lose their benefits if they used cannabis. It was an automatic, no questions asked, and doctors at the VA weren't allowed to talk to their patients about cannabis. And actually, in the record keeping at the VA, the only place that cannabis came up was in abuse, in drug abuse. So it made it even hard for VA to track what veterans were talking about cannabis as a medicine. And so there have been a few changes. One is that there's now a new box. I know it may sound small, but it's a big deal for doctors who are talking to their patients about medical cannabis, that they can actually show records of that in treatment instead of abuse. And the other is that it's up to the individual VAs of whether or not they want to allow their doctors to talk to their patients about medical cannabis, and they're not required to turn them in to lose their benefits. So it's not, you know, 100% patient protection, but there are several VAs around the United States where doctors are wanting their patients to utilize medical cannabis. there's still, the VA doctors are still not able to actually write the recommendations themselves. But the patient can actually talk to their doctor about medical cannabis.
And just to caveat, like disabled vet had to go through the whole VA system, and I remember maybe 12 years ago, they were doing just some tests on panels, and they're like, you failed your drug test. I'm like, I didn't know I was being given a drug test. Like, I have a medical marijuana card, and so I've had to go through that personally. I've also seen then veterans in HUD housing originally years ago not be able to actually stay in their HUD housing because it was federal. So I know that there's some new protections on that. I know for our organizations, our businesses, we always have veteran-like price programs, or we'll do free certifications for qualified veterans, like to get their medical cards. So normally, go to a separate doctor. On the employee protection side, this is something that you've seen, I've seen over the years. That's all federal policy. So remember, there's federally, we're breaking the law. This is state by state, territory by territory. There are certain provisions, though, when it comes to taxation and like employee, I mean, even like Citizens United type things here. So with federal employment law, the onus and like the responsibility is typically the business has the ability to say yes or no if they would allow those protections for medical cannabis. My kind of example here is that United Airlines, like even though medical cannabis might be legal, they could say, I don't want pilots to be on medical cannabis because they have 300 lives responsible. So usually that's up to the employer. Gov Guam could make some sort of provision, though, outlining these policies and procedures for business owners in Guam, or for Gov Guam members. We've even seen this in Colorado or states, to where then they have employees of the state or the territory that are actually using and or recommended medical cannabis that were scared about losing their public kind of jobs. So I think some of the FAQs that we'll write and release next week also on, I just took a note on the, like, for VA, because there's so many veterans here on Guam. I mean, what is it, highest enlistment rate per capita, which is a big honor. Thank you for the veterans here at Guam, and also providing the 2 soon-to-be 3 bases here. So for VA and kind of veterans FAQ, as well as for like in the employee protections, because I've even seen, there was one case, an individual came from South Dakota, came to Colorado, had some adult use edibles, fell off a ladder 3 weeks later in South Dakota, still had THC, you know, in their system, was fired, didn't get workers' compensation, and like they didn't have the education. And South Dakota had all rights to not allow those claims, but we have to educate patients and the government and the employers on this before more litigation can happen.
But there's also legislative steps that you can take for around employment protections. In Washington, D.C., we actually passed a law that forbids employers from testing for medical cannabis. It is illegal. Yeah. So that way, you know, someone doesn't have to disclose that they're a patient. There are all these patient privacy issues, and so I can send you that language. We actually passed it unanimously. It's been very helpful. Of course, that doesn't apply to federal employees, which, you know, makes up about half of the population, but it did protect everyone else. In the United States, 57% of the workforce is still drug tested. Of the private workforce, so that's a huge step forward.
Right.
You can also I can also send you language that has been used in various states that forbids employers from firing patients simply because they're a medical cannabis patient. So there are ways that governments are handling this, and I'd be happy to show you some examples of that legislation.
Okay, yeah, I've had some conversations with Andrea about this, and you know, we've just been doing our research, and I just want to go back to something that Nick said about Colorado, because it's my understanding that there was a patient in Colorado who had an accident, was a quadriplegic, I guess some issue with back spasms, and in this particular case, the Colorado Supreme Court actually disagreed, finding that, you know, medical cannabis could not be considered a lawful activity because of the federal law issues.
So we just want to make sure. It was a California lawsuit. It was actually, we actually took that lawsuit.
So
it's
Colorado,
raging wire.
Washington,
yep.
You know, we're looking at that, and I know that, as you mentioned, there are a bunch of states, Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, that have kind of patchwork legislation because we're tiptoeing around these federal issues.
Yep.
So, yeah, any help that you might be able to afford us so that we can make sure that especially our government of Guam employees that, you know, are patients that need this medicine, that we are able to help them with that.
So the lawsuits, the one that you're talking about in Colorado, and then there was Ross versus Raging Wire in California. That was actually a lawsuit that my organization took. There was actually not a state statute that we could refer to in the case because the legislature didn't pass it. And the same thing in Colorado. So in Washington, D.C., where we've just removed this, that was actually, there've been no lawsuits, and it's moving forward. So that's, 16 years into this, the steps that we've taken have been, using voter initiatives where possible, utilizing state legislatures where possible, and when those don't work, utilizing the courts. So there is a big patchwork, that has slowly been moving forward. And some of that, when we've had to use the courts, then the courts usually instruct us of what we need to do at the legislative level to fix the law so that it means what we want it to mean. Yeah, of course.
Yes, sir.
I just had a quick question. Knowing Guam's geographic isolation and understanding our limited population, have you come to any conclusions about the risks or the challenges to the viability of commercializing the manufacture of cannabis products on Guam?
I know I definitely always look into that. First, it's like, does it make sense, like from a business standpoint? Because I've seen great programs come forward, and why I got into the industry is like a disabled vet. The great intentions are there, but when you don't have a business that realizes it's serving patients, but patients are actually clients, and that's your revenue, and that's actually your business of serving patients. Patient numbers, qualifying conditions are really the determining factor of program success, as well as what product types are allowed, the limitations on doctors making recommendations, or how much education they have. So my organization has run those models based on the license types, what's allowed for production, your population, potential medical reciprocity, and also then run the adult use legislation from the governor's passed bill 2016. I can't remember the 34-8. Thank you very much.
Encyclopedia.
Finishing each other's sentences. It's been a couple years here. So when I looked at that, there is major economic viability here. It takes a while for these businesses to get cash flow. That's why I like to sometimes see, even in the requirements for our business applications, proof of funds, use of funds, financial budgeting, so you know you're not just going to give somebody a business license, and that, not to make limitations on businesses, but sometimes that can help with that. But you have major upside potential here. I do like limited licenses sometimes, so you don't have 30 cultivators starting, some that are doing 2,000 feet, some that are doing 10,000 square feet, and then all of a sudden, like, the cost of production, one's 1/10 of the cost, and it just puts people out of business. Like, and that's business, but that can happen here. But major upside to the even point of potentially thousands of jobs on the adult use side, billions of dollars of additional revenue based on, like, your actually, like, I wouldn't call it insulated geographic location. There's a reason you've been such a strategic military location over the years. But with the 1.6 billion people that live within Asia that don't have legal medical programs or reciprocity, for you to have 2 billion tourists a year, all the infrastructure for it, that's where, if we do a good medical program and you're interested in the adult use side, that's where there's the huge upside. But first, focusing on your patients, let's do what they ask the government to do here first. And if that's proven well, consider that in the future. I wanted to mention last part about the VA kind of questions as well. Even in Colorado, I saw there was a disabled vet who was the spouse of an active duty military person. So I'm trying to think about being a good neighbor here with, like, Anderson and with the Navy base. Also having an educational component there when you've got almost 10,000 people potentially there, and, like, you've got people on base like, oh, I have a medical card here on Guam, I can have cannabis in my home. It's actually government housing, that's on a military base, it's a federal organization, we don't want people to get, so that education component too I didn't consider about bringing, but I think that's, especially with Veterans Day on the horizon, I'll provide another FAQ on that as well.
In the United States, though, they are able to transport across state lines, right? Or they're not? So whatever is manufactured within a jurisdiction stays.
Everything is in what they own the state. And just to, another thing I would add is that I think that something that the legislature can do is add reciprocity we've actually experimented with like 7 different ways to do that. And so we can provide some language of the easier ones. And again, the best is to recognize the state card from somewhere else. I can rent a car here. I can get my prescriptions filled here. Coming from DC, and it would be great
Also
to
for
put that
the
in.
veterans too, like so many veterans retiring here, you know, traveling that side when we were looking at that and not allowing reciprocity, that's additional market share for the medical program. Even then cards from other like countries, other places, or the reciprocity if they are from somewhere else and get a doctor's recommendation here, that's where the medical tourism component, even pre-adult use potentiality, major upside. Like South Korea, Japan, China, India, Sri Lanka, the Philippines, they don't have adult use or medical programs that are actually, other than anything potentially for import right now of like specific oils from Canada or other nations. Being that access point of like first honoring your constituents' desire to have medical cannabis, but then also potentially providing that safely for the world on this side of the world, that's the economic upside, and also great thing that Guam could be providing to the world as a service that really made this entertaining and interesting 3-4 years ago.
I think the viability of the program, the types of products that are going to be made available to our patients is really dependent on how many patients we have in the program, and Senator Rodriguez is completely aware. The business component is very real, and the larger the market share, the more products that can be available to our local patients. For example, a transdermal patch. You know, if we're looking at, 2,000 patients, are we going to be able to have a manufacturing facility that's going to want to do specifically transdermal patches, or is it not going to be economically viable? But those are things that people can wear to work, time release, microdosing, where people, can actually avail of their medicine in different, more discreet ways. That's what we want to promote is a lot of people think immediately, oh, they just want to puff and smoke a joint, but that's really not what's at the heart of this. And so the economic viability is important, which, by the way, I think we're also scheduled to meet with the Guam Visitors Bureau. So maybe this can start the conversation on how to create a responsible medical tourism market, because it's going to be very unique. I don't know, maybe Nick and Steph have a better idea, but I don't. This is we're in a unique situation here, and we could be pioneers. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is we have the opportunity for our people to create a viable industry. And as long as it is federally scheduled one, we have the opportunity to build this industry from the ground up. And if in the future the Schedule 1 designation is removed, we have already established ourselves in the market that could go globally. And if you want to think big picture, when we sit here thinking about how we're going to regulate this, or what is the lab going to look like, let's think big picture and create that path. Because once that federal designation goes away, we're going to start importing everything like we do with everything else, rather than thinking about the ability to export.
And we never get to think about that as states or territories. Like we do that from Canada and other countries, but thinking about, and I like how you said that, Andrea, like when that happens. When we see major changes that I think Steph and I would have, I was always like, 8 to 10 years federal legal, and like the dates, the numbers never changed, just time kept going on. It's getting closer and closer. I mean, over half of the states, you look at the revenue that's happening from medical for adult use, like the actual impact for patients, huge viability here. When that does happen, based on your geographic location as well, low cost of production, like the sun, like your coconuts, your mangoes, your star apples do great here. I mean, as we saw yesterday in South Guam, you've got an amazing place to actually potentially, one, legal, have an international export from a medical or adult use side with a low cost of production here, high quality, and under these standards, you're already set up for international market penetration, which is a ways down the line. But let's do it right for Guam patients and kind of keep moving it forward from there.
And I just want to bring it just back, back to now, before the global market happens, and answer your question that, right now there's 9 patients in the program, and I think that often what I've seen is that governments feel like, oh look, there's no one that is even going to participate in the program, and we can show you data of where patients are not going to go through the process of getting an ID card until there is a reason to get it. And in every state, the month before dispensaries are coming online, you see the numbers go through the roof. So I just want to make sure that that the legislature is not confusing the current enrollment with the reality of what the needs are here.
Yeah, absolutely. Senator Torres, did you have any other question? I know we have the room till about noon. I want to give an opportunity to John and then back to Senator Esteves. Okay. John, did you have any?
The only thing I want to bring up is that we have 2 months, 2 more sessions before the end of the year. Thank you, Steph. Thank you, Nick. Let me start with that. And we have 2 more sessions before the end of the year. There is a current bill that was introduced by Senator Rodriguez that I would ask to bring to the floor because it would lifting the 51% specifically for the lab component. We've been waiting for local investment for about 4 years now to do that, and it's just something that I think that we should really explore at this level, because if Nick's saying that there's six, he can think of 6 right off the top of his head that are willing to come into this market, and if it's going to take somebody to stand up as Steph had said, to sue the government of Guam because we can't get this program stood up, then that's going to be, what kind of example is it going to send to our people? And I'm not saying I'm going to sit here and do that, because that's never been my intent. My intent is always to try to get this done right, and each and every person at this table has known that. By lifting this 51% and lobbying for that, at least we know that for sure we have people that are interested. You know, that's one of the biggest hurdles that everybody out on the street want to talk about. They're not looking at seed to sell. They're not sitting around this table and paying attention to the rest of the stuff that needs to happen. But at least if we say that we have a lab coming and we're making steps and leaps and bounds to do that, we'll see more patients start coming up. You know, within the last 2.5 weeks, we had 5 patients come out and get certified. Because now we have doctors coming and speaking. At one point, previous to that, we only had 4 patients certified. We still, at this point, there's only 1 patient that's been recertified. So, you know, we can't forget those kind of things, you know, and by lifting, at least I think that's something that really needs to be explored, because the legislation is already drafted before the end of this term. Moving into the whatever administration takes seat in Adelup and fills your chairs. I know you, Senator Rodriguez and Senator Esteves, are not coming back, but at least by doing so, we're putting that infrastructure in place to get these people into Guam, into the market, and start moving forward for the next administration and preparing them, setting them up for success. Yeah. Other than that,
yeah, and so that's the intent. You know, there was other measures that we tried to pursue as well, but that's the intent, is to get that through this legislative body before we do complete. Senator Esteves? Thank you, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, John. I apologize I didn't make the workshop. I was on duty this weekend. Otherwise, I would have attended. I'm not sure if it came up and if maybe we could just clarify. And it has been brought up with the issue of the seeds to get the project started if we had cultivators. And, you know, I've talked to so many different people, government officials, experts, and there's so many different answers that come with this question on how do we get the seeds to start a legitimate.
So you're living on an island, it's a paradise. There are seeds here, and there's no need to create any other regulations or any other items. If you give a license for cultivations, the seeds will come, and there's no need to regulate it.
And that's how I understand it as well.
That is the only understanding. So.
Got it.
Thank you.
Yes. Did you? Okay.
No.
Well, just on an international basis, I'm going through the Departments of Agriculture. I'm going through quarantine processes and procedures for import, export using certified pharmaceutical transport companies. Internationally, that's a whole different ballgame. In the United States, like, there's that whole Fifth Amendment thing, and every single state that has legalized medical cannabis has had to address this, every single territory. And whenever it goes too far, it's like that question that just cannot be answered. The seeds are there. They're not going to be imported across state lines, nor can your government facilitate that, like through your Department of Ag, make a special new law that operators in Colorado or Washington or other countries could be importing genetics here, because you cannot be aiding and abetting that. as a territory, the operators themselves will find the great local Mount Lam Lam varieties and move the program forward from that.
Understandable.
Post-licensing, the seeds will show up.
There was a question tapped into with regards to different states and their policies regarding workplace protections. Though, have you seen a common trend in some of the limitations of that? You know, you had mentioned, right, with United, with pilots. Do you see, though, exceptions for workplace, workplace protections for police officers, firefighters who are on duty?
Yeah, there's only one state that has prohibited police and firefighters and ambulance drivers, and that was Illinois. And unfortunately, there's a very high opioid death rate in that community as well. So it's something we do not advocate for. I think the key is also offering more information to both employees and employers. So it's, you can pass laws that require employers to set specific regulations. So instead of saying, if you're a medical cannabis patient, you lose your job, the employer can still say, if you are a medical cannabis patient, this is how you use your medication. And the good news is we don't have to make this up. Prescription drugs.
Yeah, and then that's what I was going to say. Do they typically just model after
Yes.
other opiate type drugs?
Exactly.
Don't use it while you're operating.
Exactly.
Okay.
And if an employee who has a specialty license, let's say for operating heavy equipment, if they violate the prescription drugs, there is a procedure in place where they're suspended or lose their license. Right? All of those things are already there, and we don't need to reinvent the wheel.
Now following that, and I'd have to actually probably should pose this to Department of Labor, federal contractors with providing services to the federal government under those services, would they be covered under workplace protections by local policy, or is that something that the federal government still enforces? Because we do have a large segment of a population that aren't federal employees but are federal contractors under big companies.
So I don't know of any exemptions that have been created because it's federally illegal so if the requirements for the federal contractor is that they have to require drug testing, then that would move forward. Would
that be something that your organization could maybe provide, maybe something that they can look into a bit further and how that applies?
Of course.
I mean, because the buildup is going to be a process going for a period of time. And again, I understand it's employer specific, but that might be something that we could work with these federal companies that are doing that. I just want to ensure that it's not the federal government imposing that on the individual businesses as the requirement for the contract, because then that would take out, restrict a large portion of potential patients from a medical program.
Yeah, unfortunately, if those are the requirements for the contract, my organization is in Washington, D.C., and we're trying every session to try to change these federal laws.
But is that a requirement? Is that a requirement with most of these federal?
And
that's maybe something we could.
Yeah, I mean, it probably depends on what the contract is for.
Of course.
But what we've mostly have seen is federal employees that have not been able to participate in the program.
Thank you. And my last question, again, this was to, I guess, the conversation that was had. Is that the biggest impediment, the 51% ownership that you see with the labs coming in? Because, as a businessman, you understand there are so many different options they could avail them to in terms of subsidiaries. So 51% local ownership, 49% or royalty basis profit sharing. So is that the biggest impediment to getting the labs on the island? Because there is a concern with the labs are basically the gatekeepers, and so I'm sure.
But you can't not have them. I just want to be clear.
Of course, absolutely.
Is it sometimes I've heard industry say, let's remove the labs, and I'm like, no. You cannot give an agricultural product to a patient.
I agree. I'm just wondering if that specific portion in law.
There hasn't been a request for proposals yet. There literally hasn't been a process. So I don't to be honest, I've heard this, the 51% requirement. I don't know if that's an impediment because there hasn't been an RFP. Like there hasn't been a process to ask people to apply.
Yeah,
So
or maybe if we can get some clarity, because at least my understanding is that it's out there, applications are available, but no one is expressing interest for the lab component.
Well, there's not a
There's not an
specific
application, yeah.
application for the lab. So there is for the business, for like cultivation, manufacturing, dispensaries, which an analytical lab is a very different sort of business model. At least, yeah, there are special purpose vehicles, parallel structures, lots of ways that you could structure something where it's not just the equity component. Whenever I've gone into a new country or I need to actually bring something like this or, direct it, the problem is they're bringing the knowledge and expertise. They might be bringing the cash flow. They might be bringing the business to do it. So it's hard sometimes for them to justify a minority equity position. I do think that the 51% ownership for anything that's production, manufacturing, distribution here on the island should be 51%. I like to see residency requirements. Just like Ohio, though, they had their state constitution said that you could not have quotas for like certain racial or certain groups. You can give additional points, though. I would love to see, in the future, first let's get the program going, but even like tomorrow, like certain like additional points for like own businesses, just to incentivize and have additional, businesses here. But for the lab side, I do know for 2 of the companies I talked to, they couldn't justify a business model of running a business in Asia, practically in the South Pacific, that they didn't have majority control on when it would be their company, their capital, their processes and procedures. If that was removed, it would allow 3 or 4 of those labs that I know to move in more quickly, but do not remove it for all businesses. The example RFPs that we're going to be sending over of like seed to sale, because it was just an RFI before, for a certification body as well for an analytical lab, we'll have some of those provisions of what to look for, and just the government of Guam can use those as they see fit. But that would limit certain labs now. And if that's not removed, we can contemplate different structures on how to do that.
Potentially, maybe it's not just for labs, but maybe looking at all the service providers that aren't, right? Because the seed to sale is not going to be 51% owned.
Yeah, it was just for the hands-on businesses, that 51%, and analytical labs are still subject to IRC 280E. They are touching the plant, which is why the government of Guam couldn't essentially do that, or like even your university. We've seen every state or territory try to figure out how to get past this. It's got to be private.
And that's why sorry, I know we're pressed for time, and that's why I know the 51% is good, though, because a resident here operating under local law on the under the 51% has primarily majority of that liability of the analytical lab. Correct. Because the components for an analytical lab are for the most part standardized. Exactly. Right? The equipment's standardized, the type of testings are standardized. You're just plugging in what exactly you're testing for, and that's why I'm not here to talk about, I just wanted to know if that was a specific impediment to it, because I've kind of looked at that and was wondering if this is one of the things holding us back.
It is, as well as, at least in our review of the law, unsolicited proposals to the government of Guam. Essentially, then when there is an RFP process, they are then disqualified.
Right.
So all of the companies that I've been talking to that are interested, they
won't say
not
anything and engage.
Because we need to see the RFI.
Yeah.
So we will send examples on that, but I greatly appreciate those questions. And from the notes I had and Steph took, I know we'll be sending those FAQs, added a few more, even like some ideas for the Department of Labor here, Veterans Affairs side, the RFP examples, and potentially different needs for that RFP for seed to sale and for the certification.
Could we add to that list? You had mentioned lawsuits from a delay in the program. Could you throw some of the case logs so that we can do some of the case studies, and just to tie it all in before my esteemed colleague, the chairman, closes out? I know I'm a bit long-winded. That's exactly what I was thinking, is they didn't want to engage because, in standard business practices, not always on Guam, once they engage, they're supposed to recuse themselves because then there's an automatic conflict. Exactly. That's good business, ethical practices. Can be somewhat foreign here. And that's exactly why we need to establish the commission to provide that technical expertise, because the businesses are not good to engage, because it would kind of ruin their chances to properly apply and legitimately win these contracts. So that's what I want to tie it all in. Thank you for the opportunity.
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Just in closing, just two more things in closing. One is on the lab component. We've reached out to the University of Guam, who does have a marine lab component there. Actually, they're one of the, I forget his name, one of the individuals that run the lab actually reached out to us and said, look, we have the machines with a little investment. We can be that lab for Guam. I know the university, we did reach out officially to seek their, to ask them about this is possible.
The department head and not the dean that talked to you?
Because
Yes,
there's this
yes.
other
Federal
thing
funding.
like federal
The federal
funding.
funding, yeah. So
And they'll lose their Schedule 1 license as
Okay.
well. So
Because that idea has always come up, even in Colorado, we were going to have.
we can't wait.
Yeah.
We can't wait
Yeah.
till policy moves to that. But yeah, the major issue is if they have any federal funding, that would be jeopardized. But also, the way that the Schedule 1 laws are written, you can utilize those labs for public health needs. So if a police officer finds something and wants to say, what is this, and it's
Yeah.
a Schedule 1,
But not
they're not allowed to be
facilitating the business.
commercial.
to do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's almost
So-
to second, like resample something if like a private lab before you take someone's license away or an enforcement ability.
Right.
That's
But
when
it's
those
the good
can be
news
used.
that there's likely potential employees that are coming out of
Yes,
the
yeah,
university. So
absolutely.
that's great news.
So
Yeah.
the second point is that, as I know you're looking at the commission, the composition, or the responsibilities, my only, if there's anything that I would say in closing and in parting, is that I understand now how important it is to get the program stood up. My concern is that if ever it's changed in the future on what the responsibilities are, and that the commission is the onus is put on them. You have different individuals, different people they represent, organizations they represent, could make it even a greater impediment. Just from the based on our experience here with boards and commissions, just on not being able to meet because there's no quorum, because they all have different perspectives, that could delay the program even more. What I've always said is, establish a bureau, a dedicated department, or an office that will handle this and make this a priority for them, give them resources to stand it up. And the commission could be there for guidance and technical assistance moving forward.
I think that I liked what you said earlier, that maybe the way to look at this is that the commission is there to update the program and provide advice, not necessarily to the bureau that would be overseeing it, but to the legislature. And to regulators of missing components. And so I'll definitely take that advice in when we make our recommendations. But I also think that one of the ways that we've dealt with the issue of changing administrations is that we've staggered the commission appointments so that they don't change over the administration, so that the expiration dates of those seats happen post change of government.
That's right.
But thank you so much for your
Thank you
time.
very much,
Of
Andrea.
course.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here, Senators. Zeus Masi. Thank you.